Hello, hello, and welcome everyone to In Time. My name is Nicholas Lamar Soutter, and with me, as always, is himself, Ansgar Odinson.
Hey, everybody. Merry Christmas and happy holidays to all of you.
Absolutely. And yes, 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 I'm an anti-theist, and I'm Merry Christmas. Please give me a break. Merry Christmas.
Exactly. It's a
I'm
cultural
sorry.
holiday. Come on.
It,
You know?
well, it is, and it's. I make the argument that it's really become American culture. Should it be? I don't know. That's a discussion to be had. But it's, I know Jewish people who celebrate it just because the
Right?
kids will,
Come on.
kids Yeah, but all right. So we have with us a special guest, someone I'm proud to call a friend. I love the guy, Ozzie, and we'll have him come out in a few minutes. So, and we're going to discuss philosophy, which is certainly one of my favorite just all-time subjects. I
Well, if he's a friend of
almost I was
yours,
going
he's
to get.
intelligent as hell and a pain in the ass. So,
Well, and I wanted to get a PhD in it. And I was talking about this earlier. I almost got my first peer-reviewed paper as a sophomore, but it's a long story. But one of the reasons I didn't, this one. What did the employed philosopher say to the unemployed philosopher?
hmm.
What would you like fries with that? Um,
Yeah, okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah.
I love it. I love it, and there's very little I love more, but it doesn't necessarily pay well. So, but before we do that, we got a couple things to cover. First of all, we are monetized. Anyone wants to send a super chat, you can either do it through the Streamlabs, that's in the link, and that that goes directly to us. You can also do it through YouTube. That's an easy way to send us super chats, and we do also try to keep up with the chat. But a super chat is a great way to just make sure that it's going to get directly to Ozzie or myself. We also had our Patreon hangout for the month, but we're going to do another one. We do one every month. Those are always a blast, and it's a great way to, if you want to talk about what's coming up, if you want to give us ideas for what's coming up, we always get lots of really good ideas from that. Our patrons are very important to us. So somebody did sneak a message about his mugs into, and
Hey,
really wasn't a very
man.
good sport. Wasn't a good sport about things. I'm
I'm
just
just
saying.
fighting against your shilling. I gotta
Oh,
make
please.
sure that if you're going to shill your stuff, that I beat you, because we can't let the corporatization of In Time win. Just can't be allowed.
Oh God.
And the
Okay.
only way
So
to
so
fight
I
the corporatization of In Time is buying my things.
yeah, oh, yeah, truth comes out. Yeah, I'd like everyone to point out that he just said that. That's been recorded now. So I think we all know where the hypocrisy lies. At any rate, but we do have a one other thing. So we've got let's see, we have Red's Rhetoric will be coming on to discuss rocketry, discuss NASA, discuss why the space programs, private and public, are so important to really the human race and why he's so fascinated by them.
That's
We,
a
we're
that's
also,
a
but
one I'm excited for, man. I love the space program. I'm yeah, really psyched for that
well,
one.
that was your idea too, was to really
Mm.
just, and I've been a huge fan too. I went to the Space Academy. I went to a whole bunch of NASA. I'm a big no. I am really looking forward to that, and he knows his shit. So we got him coming on. We got Dr. Richard Carrier will be coming on also in January to discuss was Jesus real, and then he'll also be coming on to discuss Christian influence in science, which has been rather profound. And so we'll discuss that. Although we've also we have him on with King Crocoduck. That would be fun. At
Ooh,
any rate,
that would be interesting, wouldn't it?
that could be our first debate. That would get contentious.
Hmm.
And then we also have the Australian fires, which is something people are not aware of. It's an extraordinarily serious problem. That is really serious. Ansgar, can you tell us a bit about that? Because I
Yeah,
think that you.
I think the big thing is there are several species, including the koala, which are being labeled as functionally extinct. In other words, so much habitat has burned from this that while there are still koalas and there is still a breeding population, there's nowhere for them to live. Not enough habitat for them to live. The only way they will survive is in captivity. This is what they mean by functionally extinct. So, likely as not, there will not be a breeding population of, as an example, koalas in the wild in our lifetime, because it's going to take. It'll be our it won't even be in our children's lifetime by the time the ecology bounces back from this, and they're able to release these animals. So yeah, it's enormous. This is an
Yeah,
enormous
and
story.
it hasn't been covered. The impeachment has been, you know, covering most of the news. So we're going to have a special guest on to discuss that, and somebody who's
Mhm.
really sort of on the front lines of this. So that'll be coming up. We were asked when are these guests, and we'll get the calendar up and running. Sort of that's kind of my bad, but our policy is to blame Canadians, so we'll blame David for that one. Reds is on the 7th, our Tuesday the 7th show, same time as always, 2 o'clock. That will be Reds Rhetoric, and then on the 27th, I believe, is when we will have on Carrier for his first appearance. And the only one other thing I want to cover before we bring out Ozzie is we do have a small update on non sequitur, and it seems inconsequential. I don't think it is. I think it's actually rather profound, and it's kind of gone under the radar. Um, the Katie Joy Paulson, who we've spoken about once or twice, and was sort of ancillary in the non sequitur stuff. She was kind of a guest host for a little while, but she has been speaking with Mr. Curtis on occasion, and they've been having dialogues back and forth. And she has on occasion also showed elements of their DMs. And you always have to be careful with DMs. You don't know if they're real or not. In this case, I think they are. It seems to me that the ones that she's released are real. But there was an interesting exchange. He has always, Mr. Curtis has always said, look, I owe Steve the money and he will get paid. In her latest release, where she talked about them, and she has seemed quite adamant that Steve needs to be paid, and that she seems to believe that there was, in fact, a business between them, and that Steve was a partner. That appears to be her position from what I've seen. So, and that of course is the position that we have taken. So I think everyone seems to be in agreement on that. And she's asked on a couple of occasions, why haven't you paid him? And on the most recent one where she did ask, he said why he didn't go to court and why he hasn't been engaging on this rather serious issue. I don't care about it. I have completely moved on. I answer a letter here or there from the court, but right now, he seems to be having difficulty proving damages. I don't know. I've stopped caring about Steve. She then asks, why haven't you paid him? And Mr. Curtis replies, after the shit he did to me and everyone after, not a chance. I find this rather,
Hmm.
this is really an admission that he said before he owes him the money. So what he is saying now is he will not pay him, despite agreeing that he does owe him, at a minimum, the money up until the date that they separated. There's contention about what happens after that. But Mr. Curtis has always said that he owes legally Steve McRae the money up until that date. And he is now saying, well, I don't like him. I don't like what he's been doing, and I'm not going to pay him for that reason unless a court orders me, is what he said. So I don't know. What do you think, Ansgar?
It sounds. I mean, to me, that sounds like somebody saying, "Well, I don't like this guy, so it's okay if that I steal from them."
That's kind of like what it sounds like to me, and it begs a whole bunch of questions. Now, he said he's already paid the taxes on it. Well, if he's paid the taxes on it, so then, which first of all, he actually legally can't do. He can't pay Steve's taxes for him without, even your accountant can't pay your taxes for you without a signature. So I don't know how he's done that, but if he has, then that money is definitely Steve's. If he hasn't, then he's committed fraud. And what's he going to do with the money? I don't think he's going to give it to charity. Is he going to spend it? Um, that he's not going to pay, in my mind, is a shocking claim,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
he's now saying he's going to steal it. That's
Mhm.
the only conclusion,
And the
and he's
reason
been
is
accused of it.
because let's grant that Steve's been dick. Let's just grant for the sake of this conversation. Um, that's your reason. Someone's been a dick, so
Yep.
yeah.
So, all right, now what we have, yeah, I find that rather profound. It is a massive change in his position, and it is a change to the position I will not pay him, despite having always said, and despite all sides, since this started, saying at a minimum, all sides agree that until I think it was July or January 11th, which was the date that this unceremonious separation happened, that he's owed the full money. This is the first time Mr. Curtis has said he will not pay him.
Yeah.
I think
And
that's
he
worth
hasn't said
updating.
that he doesn't owe it. He hasn't changed his position. It's just I'm not going to pay what I owe. Yeah.
Yep. So I figured that was worth covering. I don't think it's worth spending a lot of time on, but
No.
yeah, that's pretty staggering. So all right. So that having been said, let me please bring out Ozymandias Ramses II.
And here he is.
Ozzie,
Hello, gentlemen.
how are you?
I'm very well, thanks. Merry Christmas to you both.
Merry
Merry
Christmas.
Christmas. Happy War on the Holidays. Hold on a second. Let me.
Are we still doing the war on holidays?
Well, yes.
I don't know, but
I went and I bought dozens of red cups that don't say Merry Christmas just in preparation for this war.
all right. So we're going. Yep. So I think first I'd like to do is Ozzie. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself, just sort of in general, and also about your background in philosophy?
Sure. So my name is Ozymandias Ramses II. That's my YouTube handle. I have a YouTube channel where I make content very infrequently, less frequently of late. But I'm involved in the great debate, so my content tends to be about apologetics and counter-apologetics, typically of a philosophical nature. And I sort of joined the great debate community on YouTube about around 2013, around the time when Seitan Bruggencate was peddling this presuppositional line of apologetics that had caught on, and I decided to sort of join the YouTube scuffle about that and related issues because I had a background in philosophy. So a little bit more about myself. I live in Canada. I have a background in contemporary analytic philosophy. I am not a philosopher. I'm not a teacher of philosophy. I was a grad student in philosophy. I started a PhD. I didn't complete a PhD, so I don't have a doctorate in philosophy. I don't occupy a chair in philosophy. I'm not a lecturer or anything like that, although I did teach philosophy to undergraduates when I was a grad student myself. And my area of specialty at the time was contemporary analytic philosophy and the philosophy of language, and specifically philosophy of language and epistemology, I should say, in the analytic tradition. So I was able to bring a background in those kinds of philosophical questions to the issue of counter-apologetics, and specifically countering presuppositional apologetics. So that was sort of my claim to fame when I joined the community.
We're going to have to discuss at some point because Steve says the same thing, and I am very much in disagreement about sort of what makes a philosopher. I think a philosopher is a mindset more than anything else, and I think people who are reasonably close to that mindset can spot one regardless of their training. And by my book, Steve would be a philosopher. I just don't say that in general because he doesn't like labels and he doesn't want to be called one. But having said that, he's got the mindset, and you certainly do too. So you can sit there and say you're not a philosopher. Okay, fine. So many people are running away from whether or not they're a philosopher. Fine. Okay.
Well, let me explain why I say that. I agree with you. I think that one can be a philosopher without having a degree in philosophy, without having a position in a philosophy department or something like that. I don't think that's required to be a philosopher. However, if you go around on YouTube describing yourself as a philosopher, people are to be excused for thinking that you are a published philosopher, that you publish in academic journals, that you have a doctorate, that you occupy some kind of position in a university philosophy department. And that's not true of me. And so that's why I'm always repudiating that label, because I simply don't want people to be misled and think that I have credentials that I don't in fact have.
Oh, that makes sense.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
That's a fair point. So did we ever need? So okay, well, what is the goal of philosophy, and what is the goal of philosophy?
Let me open up with
please.
something real quick. One of the things I hear often is people saying, "I hate philosophy." Seriously, this is a very, very common thing. Is I hate philosophy. and it usually comes in when somebody uses a, either a philosophical definition or a philosophical argument in a discussion about ethics or morality or something like that. But all the time I hear, I hate philosophy. So from the two people that one could potentially call a philosopher here, I would definitely like to ask, what is the goal of philosophy, and why should we not hate philosophy?
That's I wish I could say that those weren't well put, but it really was.
That's an excellent question. Okay, so well, what is philosophy? I have a very deflationary view of philosophy. I'm not someone who thinks that there is a domain of inquiry or domain of questions that properly bounds philosophy. So, for instance, if you're a geologist, well, there's a domain of inquiry, right? There are certain things that have to do with, terrestrial formation and rocks and things like that. That defines the domain of inquiry of geology. The same thing could be true of cartography. The same thing could be true of medicine, art history, and so forth. Philosophy is more broad-ranging than that. Some philosophers think that philosophy does have a domain. It deals with questions of ultimacy, for instance, ultimate questions. Right? I don't think that's true. The way I view philosophy is this. What there are questions. We have all kinds of questions, how much is that bar of soap? What ought I to value in life? What's the meaning of life? Is there life on other planets and stuff like that? There's all kinds of questions for which we have answers, questions for which we don't have answers. For any question for which we don't have an answer, there's usually going to be some discipline, some area of human inquiry or human discourse where we think we know how to get the answer. So if I have a question about rocks, for instance, I'm going to consult a geologist. If I have a question about physical health and illness, I'm going to consult a doctor and someone in the field of medicine. In other words, there are, for any question that a human might have, we recognize that if there are not people who are experts, there's at least some domain of expertise, right? There is the question will admit of an answer. We just need to apply certain techniques. There are certain conceptual categories that we ought to invoke. There are certain methods. There are certain experts in those methods. And even if they don't have the answer right now, they're the people to ask. But then there's all the questions that are left over that don't belong to any discipline. And any question that does not fall into any discipline, invariably, that is a persisting question that endures, right? Anything that has not been subsumed in some other discipline, right? That ends up being called a philosophical question. And that's why philosophical questions always seem like they are without answers. They are all of the recalcitrant questions, all of the questions that have been of enduring concern to us that for which we do not have an area of human discourse where we feel confident that this area of human discourse is going to crack that problem, is going to answer the question. Very often, these are questions like, what is art? What is beauty? What is the good? Is human knowledge possible? In what does human knowledge consist? What is the nature of the mind? How is consciousness possible? All of these sorts of questions. These are questions where we think, well, they bear some connection perhaps with some discipline in the sciences or in the humanities or in the social sciences or in the arts. But those disciplines do not exhaust these questions. They do not provide answers, and there's always this remainder. And very often with these questions, we just feel as if we don't know where to begin, right? And so I have this rather deflationary view of philosophy. Philosophy is just the dump where we keep all of the questions for which there does not exist a system of thought or a discipline where we think if we apply this discipline to these questions, that question will admit of an answer. That's how I view philosophy. And I think that it explains in part why it is so frustrating. As soon as someone raises a question that we recognize is an enduring question, which does not seem to admit readily of any answer, it doesn't seem to succumb to any procedure or discipline, we feel frustrated. We feel right off the bat, boy, we're in for a long argument here, that we're probably not going to get very far in this. And I think this goes to your question, Ansgar, about should we not hate should we hate philosophy or not? No, I don't think we should hate philosophy. These are important questions. They are enduring questions. They keep coming back. They keep coming back because they are of interest to people. They are intrinsically interesting to us. That's why they don't just go away.
Well, two things.
Well,
First of all, that was beautifully, eloquently put. So well, so much so that it actually silenced the chat as everybody was listening. Second of all, I'd like to, I think you really hit something on there that it is frustrating.
well, let me
Go
actually
ahead.
though I want to take a quick answer at that because I have a very different answer.
Okay.
So
Mhm.
and I'm curious to hear Ozzie's. So I look at it almost the opposite. I think all questions started with philosophy. I think philosophy was let's start thinking about things, and then sciences broke out from that, and other ways of thinking broke out from that. And what was left, I agree. I think what was left is what's sort of still in philosophy until things can be codified. But I think the job of a philosopher is to take apart people's assumptions, and I don't think anybody likes that. And I understand.
No.
I don't like it. I don't like when I sit there and say, well, I think A, B, C, D, E is true, and then people start to say, well, wait a minute, are you sure? It's like, no, let me keep what I believe. And I think the job of a philosopher is to dissect and take those things apart. I think you have to try to do it politely and kindly, and realize that you could be really assaulting people's fundamental beliefs. But I think that's why people, in my view, that's why people don't like philosophers. And I concur with that, because I sometimes don't like that either. Doesn't mean it's not necessary or important, but in my view, that's why people don't like philosophy. Because we're the ones, and Ozzie, you and I had done a thing on Hume's problem of induction. And that's one that annoys the living daylights out of people when you bring that up. And if you decide to really make an issue of that with somebody, it's like, yeah, you've got assumptions there. And like, no, I don't. Yes, you do. And especially if you're talking to an anti-theist who says, I don't make assumptions, I'm perfectly rational. It's like, you can take them apart pretty easily, and then all of a sudden nobody likes philosophers. So I really like your view. I think we each have a different view on it. But sorry, I wanted to
Yeah,
answer
no.
that.
I was actually going to kind of bring up the exactly what you're talking about the assumptions. Where people tend to, in my experience, tend to really get frustrated with philosophy is when they want an easy answer to a question. They've assumed they already have an easy answer to a question, and you or someone points out that, well, maybe the answer you have isn't as easy as you think it is. Perhaps you should look at it this way or that way, or here's where the way you're thinking about it is even potentially a fallacy, and that definitely tends to upset some people.
Yeah,
I wanted to.
please, please.
I was just going to add to what Nick was saying. So, from my view, this sort of deflationary view can be sort of seen historically, right? Before there were sciences, before we had sort of divisions like the natural sciences, the social sciences, the humanities. Just imagine there were people and there were questions, right? In the fullness of time, we start to answer some of these questions, right? Everything can be construed as a philosophical question if you like. When I say what is philosophy today, what I mean is philosophy is today what remains unanswered that is an enduring question, right? Some questions have been answered, right? But there were questions like, well, you know, how it exactly um, uh, does water become a solid? How exactly does water become a gas? Does it turn into something else, or is it always the same thing? Right? These kinds of questions were once philosophical questions. Right? Now we see that this is a question in physics. As soon as a question admits of an answer, as soon as it will succumb to some method, to some conceptual apparatus that lets us crack that problem, it drops out of philosophy. It becomes a chapter in the sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities, and the arts, and something else. Um, uh, that's just in the nature of moving a question from the realm of I haven't a clue how to begin answering this to I think I have a way to get an intellectual grip on this problem. So, Nick, the way that you were characterizing it as everything was once a philosophical problem, I think that's largely true. Everything that was sort of an enduring, persistent problem, I think, did start off as a kind of philosophical question. Everything that we regard as a question in the natural sciences, for instance, was at one time considered part of something called natural philosophy, right? Philosophy was this big umbrella. Science is a more recent term for that. But for a long time, it was considered natural philosophy. And before that, they didn't even distinguish between natural philosophy and other kinds of philosophy. But yeah, so I think both our views are actually quite consistent with one another there.
Yeah, well, yeah, and I think you and I, but you see, this is why, yeah. So this is why Ozzie knows more than I do about this. Ozzie kicks my ass, but I think, yeah, no, I agree. I think they're both right, but I think we start from different places and work to a sort of a common middle, but the other ends are still there for each of us, if that makes any sense. I'm nowadays. So I got a degree in education a very long time ago, but I didn't actually teach in high school until just recently. I started doing a couple of years teaching high school. There's all this new language, but one of them that I really like is a big thinker. It's a person who takes a look at things very large first and then starts to work their way into the details instead of people work from the details out. And I was like, yeah, I think I tend to jump into that sort of thing. So what is it that attracted you to philosophy, and do you think we still need it?
Well, definitely. I'll answer the second question first, quickly. Yeah, I think we still need it. I'll get into that later. How I got into philosophy, that was pure accident. I was one of those people that had no time for philosophy. I had started out as an undergraduate as a psychology student. I was interested in scientific psychology in the kind of behaviorist tradition. I had no time for philosophical questions. I had taken some philosophy courses in college. It didn't grab me. It seemed somewhat fruitless and pointless and frustrating the way most people find philosophy initially. And as I was pursuing my undergraduate degree, I didn't want anything to do with philosophy. I was one of those guys that thought, oh, philosophy, what's it ever done for us? I confess now, I regard that with some embarrassment now, but that was my view for a long time. But then I enrolled in a liberal arts college, which was one of those classic books programs, the great books program. You start with the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Bible, and you kind of plow through as many classics of the Western canon as possible. So you read books in every area of the Western canon, and the books and the works and the questions that I found the most interesting, reading them sort of in chronological order through the intellectual history of the Western tradition, the questions and books that interested me the most recurringly were the philosophical works. I don't know why, but it was works like Augustine and Montaigne and Hume and Descartes and all of those. I ended up writing all my papers on those as opposed to other subjects. And so I discovered that I had a passion for philosophical questions. That's how I came to it, quite by accident. I didn't go seeking it out. I was no more interested. In fact, I was less interested in philosophical questions than I was in the history of the Western intellectual tradition. But of course, you can't sort of go through a program like that without coming away with some respect for Western philosophy. And so that's how I came to it. As for the value of philosophy, the questions of philosophy are, as I said, enduring questions. They don't go away. They just keep coming back generation after generation. Wittgenstein had a metaphor for this. He said that it's just scratching an itch. Now, if you're itchy and you don't have a salve, you don't have something to get rid of the rash, the best that you can do is scratch. And that's one way to think of philosophy. Philosophy is applying reason to a problem. We have a question, we don't know how to answer it. There does not exist a discipline that will help us crack this problem. It doesn't admit of a solution given everything that we know. So all that we can do is cast about and look at everything we do know and see, apply what we do know and apply just pure reasoning and try to figure out what's the best way to characterize this problem. Sometimes it's not a matter of just directly answering the question, it's trying to formulate the question in such a way that it will admit of an answer. And that, I think, is something that we have to keep doing. Unless you are simply incurious about important and enduring questions, you're going to want to have answers. Now, everyone at some point gets tired of asking and trying to struggle with a difficult, enduring question. But if you're the type of person where it just keeps bothering you and you keep reading a little bit more about it and revisiting it, and you don't really tire of thinking about it once and for all, then I think that makes you someone with a kind of philosophical disposition, and you might throw yourself into it as a career or something like that, or not. But in any case, I think the reason we still need philosophy is because we want a systematic account of everything. We want to understand everything. We want answers to all of the questions. And when we have important questions that are remaining, we still want to make sense of them. We want answers to those questions, but we don't just want any old answer to those questions. We want those answers to somehow be consistent with the rest of our ontology and our epistemology. We want them to fit in with our overall conception of the world and reality and ourselves and our place in the world, right? And so we have to apply our reason to this. So to the extent that you are not incurious, and you want answers to this, the best that you can do is apply your reason and reach for every scrap of knowledge that we have on a question that we think might bear on the particular point before us. And so philosophy isn't going to go away. It doesn't matter if a person says we don't need it. It's not going anywhere. The itch is with us. We just have the itch, and all we can do is scratch and hope at some point we sort out a way of representing the problem. We can cash out the problem in such a way that it will admit of an answer, and it will either admit of an answer that is that is subsumed under some existing science or area of human discourse, or it will bring about a new area of human discourse or a new branch of knowledge. And then at that point, it'll be part of that branch of knowledge, and it'll drop out of sort of the curriculum of philosophy, and it will no longer be seen in hindsight as a philosophical question. It'll be a chapter in some area of human knowledge.
Well, so let me ask you two questions, and I think we so it's a little out of order for where we're going, because I would like to ask you, what are some examples that you can think of questions that we're working on right now that people are thinking about that need to be answered? But I'd also, just to give this some form, because I think people think that philosophy is just people thinking, and there is some truth to that, but there are tools to philosophy and there are branches of philosophy. Now, you used two words just a short while ago, which I think some people know and some people don't. You used the word epistemology and you used the word ontology. And I think there are certain branches of philosophy. So if maybe you could hit what are some of the branches that are most common, what are maybe some tools, and then what are some things that we're thinking about right now and that philosophy is grappling with right now.
Okay.
Well, a lot. I'm hitting you with a lot.
Yeah. Okay. If I forget one of those questions, just remind me.
I'm going to keep you busy. Oh, don't worry.
All right. Well, for categorizing philosophy, there are different schemes for categorizing philosophy, right? There are different schools for categorizing types of philosophical questions or types of philosophical problems. Okay. So the one that people will know immediately is ethics or moral philosophy. Questions that have to do with what you should do and what you shouldn't do, what is permissible and impermissible, right? So as soon as you start talking about what you may do, what you may not do, what you ought to do, what you should do, what you must do, right? What you have an obligation to do, what is absolutely prohibited or impermissible. These kinds of questions, these questions that have to do with what are called moral oughts, imperatives, these kinds of normative questions fall into either ethics or moral philosophy. And we don't have to quibble about how you carve that up, because different people carve that up differently. But the point is, there's a whole section within philosophy called moral philosophy. That's certainly a set of questions that everyone thinks is important. It's important in your practical reasoning every day about how you're going to treat other people. You may have been taught certain things are right and wrong growing up, which you now regard as erroneous. You may have been taught, as I was growing up, that homosexuality is absolutely bad, that homosexual people are bad, that homosexuality itself is bad and deviant and contrary to the will of God, and unnatural and unwholesome and damaging to everyone who participates in it, and damaging to social institutions such as marriage. These are beliefs that I had growing up. At some point, I came to call into question my religion, and when I came to question my religion, eventually I realized I didn't have any good reason for my moral objections to homosexuality and homosexuals. Okay? Now, presumably, people have opinions one way or the other on the question of homosexuality and homosexuals. Um, uh, and you have opinions about heterosexuality and bisexuality and everything having to do with sexuality. Well, these are philosophical questions. They're moral questions. Moral questions are philosophical questions. Moral philosophy is a chapter of philosophy. Then there are questions about what can we know? What is humanly attainable as knowledge by human beings? Are there different kinds of knowledge? Is there a difference between knowing that 2 + 2 = 4, and knowing that a bachelor is an unmarried man, and knowing that homosexuality is permissible, and knowing that the moon is a satellite of the earth, and so forth, right? Are there different categories of knowledge? Okay, so that questions like that, okay, those are epistemological questions. Other epistemological questions would be something like, well, okay, what is knowledge? Is it enough to just have a belief that's true? Or is there more required? Is justification or warrant required for you to know something? Or is it sufficient to simply know something that you believe it to be true and it be true? So questions about justification, the relationship between evidence and conclusions. That is a chapter of subchapter within epistemology. Okay.
All that falls under epistemology. So we have
all of that falls under
ethics,
epistemology.
Epistemology. Okay.
Yeah. Another area would be another broad area would be ontology. Ontology comes from the Greek word ontos. It has to do with being, that is, that which is. Right? So if I ask you, what exists, right? Well, different people carve up the fundamental nature of reality differently. Some people, for instance, let's say they're physicalists or philosophical materialists, think that there's just matter in motion. They'll say things like, all there is matter and all there is energy. Okay, those would be monists. That's an ontological position. That's a position about ultimately the furniture of reality consists of itsy bitsy physical particles or something like that in fields of force, right? That's what they think exists. Then there are other people who are dualists. They say, well, no, actually, things like beliefs and desires and emotions and stuff like that. All of your mental life, they don't think that that's reducible to the physical. Those would be dualists. They think that there's another kind of stuff, and there's another kind of material, another kind of substance in reality. Those would be substance dualists. They believe in mind and they believe in matter. And they think that these are two fundamentally irreducible kinds of stuff. So that's an ontological question. So ontology is that branch of philosophy that deals with what is ultimately real, right? Are there human beings, are there bodies walking around, or are there just clouds of particles and electrons moving around, which we just call people, but there aren't really people, right? So that would be another kind of ontological question.
You heard did you hear? Oh, there was that a woman. She was a solipsist. She sent a letter to Bertrand Russell. Said, I'm a solipsist, but I'm concerned because I appear to be the only one.
Yeah. Well, just don't knock her off. Then we're all gone if you do.
All right. I'm sorry. I apologize. So inside philosopher joke. That's so okay. Please continue.
Okay. So another branch of philosophy would be something like axiological questions, like that have to do with values and aesthetics. What is art? What is beauty? Is beauty really just in the eye of the beholder? If I say, that statue is beautiful, am I just describing something about myself? an emotional reaction that I'm having, or am I in fact pointing to objective features in the work of art? Can a person be wrong in their assessment about what is beautiful? Is there no right and are there no right and wrong answers, or is it just purely subjective? In which case, you don't have to pay any attention to what a person thinks is beautiful, because all they're doing is making an autobiographical statement. Right? So that would be another chapter of philosophy. So there's many ways of breaking down philosophy. Some of them cut across these disciplines depending on what your typology is. I'm not too hung up on the typology of philosophy, but if you enroll in a philosophy program, these are the kinds of courses that you'll take. You'll take a course in ethics. You'll take a course um, in epistemology. You'll take a course in ontology and metaphysics and so forth.
All right. So I hope we've got a good idea. Ansgar, I don't know. Did you have any questions or?
So first of all, it sounds like there's a lot that people would not even. It sounds like people engage in philosophy without even knowing it, considering all the things that would be subsumed under that umbrella. But how do you reach out as somebody who, is involved in the philosophical world, if nothing else? How do you reach out to, people and make them not hate philosophy? What do you how do you be a good how should I put it, a spokesperson for philosophy? Because I'm telling you, there's a lot of hate for philosophy. There really is.
Yes. Yeah, there is, and some of it well earned. Okay, well, first of all, I said there's all these questions remaining. Okay, so there's a certain loose sense of, in which you can say, well, anybody's a philosopher. Anyone who discusses these enduring questions is doing philosophy. In the same sense that anybody is a scientist. Anyone who's concerned with trying to explain phenomena in the natural world can be broadly understood to be engaged in a scientific enterprise. But really, what makes a person a scientist is having some training in the study of that question. And what makes a person a philosopher is someone who's had some kind of training in dealing with that question. So yes, you can watch the Oprah Winfrey yammering and opining about all kinds of things, and she thinks she's doing philosophy. Well, as I said, she's certainly interested in philosophical questions, but she doesn't know any philosophy. She hasn't read anything about what she's talking about, except maybe some book that she's pushing or something like that. But I mean, for some people, that's what they think philosophy is. I mean, when I was teaching undergraduate students, invariably you'd get one or two students who'd wander into a first year undergraduate philosophy class, and they thought that philosophy consisted of simply sitting down and opining out loud on some question, and that then you were doing philosophy. Well, you're no more doing philosophy when you just walk in without having done any reading or actually seriously thought about a question or engaged anybody on it, and you just opine out loud. You're no more doing philosophy than if you were to just walk into a forest, look at some trees, and venture some opinions about the nature of trees and plant life, and consider yourself a botanist. Obviously, there's more that you have to do. So, I mean, one of the things that I sort of, if I'm going to be serving as an ambassador for philosophy, is I'm going to encourage people to not assume that everyone who's just opining out loud on some difficult, substantial, enduring question is doing philosophy. What they're doing is they're just opining out loud on something, but they're not qualified. They haven't really thought about it. They haven't done any homework. They haven't done any kind of due diligence. You don't have to do a lot. You can crack open any little introductory book. You can go to, you can go onto, Chapters or Amazon or something like that and download Philosophy for Dummies, and you'll be 100 miles ahead of Oprah Winfrey as soon as you do that. So that's the first thing. Just stop thinking that everyone who's just opining out loud is doing philosophy. Yes, they're opining on a philosophical question, but they're not doing philosophy any more than if they were to opine on a scientific question, they're doing science. That's the first thing. Another reason people hate philosophy is that it's difficult. Contrary to popular belief, because philosophy isn't just opining out loud, it requires that you have done some study. It requires that you have read some of the best that has been thought and said on a difficult question. Right away, you're going to discover the landscape of possible opinions on a certain question. you're going to come to appreciate arguments for the various positions and against the various positions. And you're going to discover, invariably, that the landscape is much more complicated and much more difficult than you thought it was. If a lot of people, when they're confronted with a philosophical question, will have very strong opinions, and they will insist that it's like this and everyone else is just nuts. And it's usually really just an expression of their own ignorance on the question. It's very, this is Dunning-Kruger, it's very, very easy to be confident about an opinion on a difficult philosophical question if you have not done any reading on it. So one of the reasons people don't like philosophy is that to do philosophy at all means to have done some homework, and that homework can be difficult. It can mean reading about opinions that are really vastly at odds with your own, but for which there are actually pretty good arguments, and where there may be really decisive arguments against your own naive pre-theoretical or pre-philosophical position on the question. So that's another reason that it can be frustrating.
I've experienced that one quite a bit. People being upset by the idea that they have to consider a viewpoint that is counter to their own, and consider it in a way that's substantial.
Yeah, it's always the hardest one, is when you have a very fixed opinion on, say, a moral question. That's the one that hangs us up the most frequently. We have some strong moral opinion, and then someone hits us with something else, and it just seems like, how in the world could you possibly think that? And really, that reaction is simply born of ignorance, of simply not having been acquainted with this alternative viewpoint, right? And the people's initial reaction is to dismiss it. And one of the nice things about philosophy, though, when you read some philosophy, there's two huge benefits that come from philosophy, which is, I think, a reason why people should be interested in philosophy and why they should pursue it, even just as a kind of intellectual hobby. One is practically everything that we think of as critical thinking, everything that's in the critical thinking toolbox, is born of philosophy. When you take a course in critical thinking or a course in logic, you'll be taking that course in the philosophy department, right? So to study critical thinking, to study logic, formal and informal, is to study philosophy. To become skilled in critical thinking is to become schooled in the tools that have been delivered to us by philosophy. There's this long history, right? When we talk about fallacies, right? I literally taught a course that was just fallacies. It was an intro critical thinking course. There are different ways of teaching critical thinking. One of the ways that I taught the course was fallacies. We're just going to do fallacy theory. I'm just going to acquaint the students with as many fallacies as I can pickle into their heads in the course of the semester. So if you think that it's important to know fallacies, that is, it's important to be able to identify incorrect forms of reasoning, all the ways that you can arrive at conclusions incorrectly, right? If you think that's important, well, that's a chapter of philosophy. That's one of the things that you learn in the course of philosophy is how not to reason, how to avoid reasoning badly. So that's one of the and another thing that philosophy teaches you is, because you are constantly having your own ideas abut against views completely at odds with your own, and you have to familiarize yourselves with the arguments for that position. You can't just attack every position. You have to know the arguments for that position. Mm-hmm. One of the things that happens is, over time, it becomes reflexive, that you're able to assess your own positions, even ones you have not considered in depth, and look at them and go, why exactly do I believe this? And then you try to sort of marshal the evidence and consider, why do I actually believe this? Do I just believe this because it kind of lines up with this other belief for which I do have some good reasons, but I don't have good reasons directly for the thing that I'm talking about right now? Or do I actually have good reasons? And you end up being able to put some emotional distance between yourself and your own beliefs. You aren't less wedded to your beliefs. You aren't less engaged politically and morally with your beliefs, but you're better positioned to evaluate your own positions. And if you don't know what the liabilities are of your own positions, if you only know the arguments for and you can't think of any good arguments against your position, if you think there aren't any good arguments against your position, you're probably not very well versed in your own position, right? So that's one of the things that philosophy delivers to you is it delivers some actual skill in the art of reasoning well, and it allows you a certain distance when evaluating other views and even evaluating your own views when you apply it seriously. And that's actually very important, and it's intellectually very, very humbling to do that. And one of the things about rationality is it's not just rationality isn't just about having all the right beliefs. It's making sure that your confidence in your beliefs, in the things that are in your belief set, that your confidence scales with the reasons and the evidence for that belief. And your confidence can only be well calibrated if you know what the arguments are for your beliefs and you know what the arguments against your beliefs are, the things that undercut or weaken or should call into question your confidence. So there's a lot of ways to be irrational, but two ways to be irrational primarily. One is to have more confidence than your beliefs have earned, and the other is to not be confident enough about a belief when there are good reasons available that you're simply ignorant of. So you don't want to be too confident in your beliefs. You don't want to be underconfident in your belief. But the only way that you can sort of calibrate your confidence is to be aware of the arguments for and against your position and other positions that are out there. And that's one of the things that philosophy delivers. So from a personal point of view, I think it's really invaluable. And if anyone fancies themselves a critical thinker or a skeptic, you really ought to learn some philosophy. It will help you.
Well, a lot of this sounds like a perfect tool for subverting some of the most, as social apes, we have certain things that are just true about the way our minds work. And the human brain is set up to do as little thinking as possible. Like to be as efficient as possible, it actually tries to do as little thinking as possible and make as many assumptions as possible. This is true in both the way we think, even in the way we see and hear. Our brain makes a whole lot of assumptions because if we actually had to consciously, take in all of our stimuli, it would overload us. You know what I mean? And so the same thing is true with the way in which we think. And so a lot of this is a tool to get around that rather fundamental human limitation. It's a way of stopping ourselves from making those assumptions as best we can. We're not going to be perfect, and it's a tool set to sort of subvert that and force us to stop and really consciously think about the things that we normally just would gloss over and make assumptions about. And I know that Nick's had some questions too.
Well, I did, and I think you're talking about fallacies, and I think actually, especially if Ozzie, we should do a show just on fallacies because I'm those are huge, and how the brain takes shortcuts that just our reasoning goes right out the window. One of my favorites that I mention all the time is affirming the consequent, but there's a whole bunch of others. But that one's a biggie. I did. We have a lot of questions. Iron Charioteer has asked a lot of questions, and I really want to get to them. But what I'd like to do is actually just get to, because there was a question that we were on earlier, and I want to make sure we really hit it because I think it's important and worthy of some significant discussion, which is what is philosophy struggling with right now? And I do think, for example, abortion is a good example. That's the easiest one, but I think there are other ones. Now, the head of the department at Clark University, which is where I got my undergraduate. His name was Patrick Durr, and he had come up with, he was a medical ethicist, but he had come up with an extraordinarily original argument that was a pro-life argument, and I'd always been 100% pro-choice. I heard this argument and was the only one that ever shook me. I'm now much more on the fence than I used to be, but it was an unbelievable argument. It was really well done. So I think that's one that people are struggling with. What are some other modern issues that philosophy is tackling? Do you think that's a philosophical one? And then if so, what are some others that maybe is in the realm of philosophy today?
Yeah, well, certainly the abortion question is a question in moral philosophy, because at least from the standpoint of some people, an abortion is a murder, an unlawful homicide. Um, so it is important to describe the problem carefully. That's why some people will insist, oh, well, a fetus isn't a human being, because if it's not a human being, it's not a person. If it's not a person, it's not a murder. Whereas other people will insist, no, if it's a human being, then it's a person, and if it's a human being and it's a person, and you kill this person and they're innocent, it doesn't matter where they are, it doesn't matter that they're in the womb, then it's a murder, right? So when people are debating that, they are explicitly engaged in a number of philosophical questions. They're they are involved in the moral question of what a murder is. They're involved in the question of bodily autonomy and where one's rights end and where another person's begins. They're involved in the question of what a person is or what a human being is, and the question of personal identity. I mean, these are all big philosophical questions, and they intrude, which is why the problem seems so intractable. There's a lot of philosophical questions that are at stake here, and almost everyone's position, whatever position they take, whether pro-choice or pro-life or some other position, you are almost always coming to that position by virtue of having in your own mind explicitly or implicitly answered questions like, what is murder? What is a human being? What is a person? What rights do we have, and where do they extend, and how are they affected by where can they run into conflict with other people? What are the conditions for personhood, and so forth, right? So what can the state do? What sorts of actions can the state legitimately engage in? What restrictions can it impose upon us? Right? These are all big, huge philosophical questions, right? And so people come to their positions and they think, oh, they're just coming at it by looking dispassionately at the facts. But in fact, all of those facts are being viewed through the lens of commitments that they have to theories of personhood, theories of identity, theories about rights, theories about what the state can do and can't do. So yeah, that's a huge philosophical question, because it's not one philosophical question. It is a suite of philosophical questions, and you can have any number of positions on those. And that's why it's so intractable. That's why it's so hard and so frustrating. Yet another reason why people hate philosophy is the more you think about it, the more you realize, wow, we're not, whatever answer we're going to come to, it's going to rest on people coming to some agreement on a number of questions that are really, really kind of hard to even specify, much less answer. Other questions, huge questions right now about what is the value of the university? What is the mission of a university? What about freedom of thought and expression? Where do individual rights and when do collective rights take over? Is there such a thing as collective rights as opposed to individual rights, or are collective rights merely reducible to individual rights, and so forth? There are huge questions about language, what can be said and what can't be said. There are all kinds of huge moral questions, but I mean, let's look at sort of outside of the moral sphere. How exactly am I conscious? What is the neurophysiology of consciousness? How are our mental states occasioned or caused by the oatmeal textured stuff inside of my skull? How is that possible? We know an awful lot about brain states. We know tons about the neurophysiology and the micro neuroanatomy inside of our brains, right? But we still don't have answers to questions like, why exactly does alcohol make us drunk? Why does red look red as opposed to some other color? How does aspirin cure our headaches? How exactly are memories stored in the brain? What is the neurophysiology of consciousness? How is mental life possible? How is it that sitting here in Canada, I'm able to think about fires in Australia? How is the oatmeal textured stuff in my head, which is just matter, how is it able to be about or refer to a state of affairs elsewhere in the world? How is that even possible? right? We know it's true, but how is it possible, right? So everything, almost all of the questions that Descartes and the ancients were struggling with in connection with what we would now call the mind-body problem, those questions remain, even though we've learned an enormous amount about brains. We do not know how to reduce mental states to brain states. There's all kinds of theories about whether that's possible and how it's possible. There are theories. There are identity theories, type identity theories, token theories, token identity, token type token theories. There's reductive materialism. There's teleofunctional theories, teleosemantic theories. There's all kinds of theories in what's called the philosophy of mind and the cognitive sciences. There's Turing functionalism, for instance. That basically your mind is your brain is just a computer. Your mind is just the software, and so forth, right? There's all kinds of ideas in the philosophy of mind that try to answer this question or these questions, but nothing settled. There's no settled science here on how it is possible that the oatmeal textured stuff in my skull can generate a mental life and generate the mental life that it does, as opposed to a whole bunch of different mental states. So that's another kind of question. Then there's all kinds of aesthetic questions about art and so forth. Then there's all the bioethics questions that have nothing to do with abortion. Then there's everything in political philosophy. What is a legitimate form of government? Right? Where does the legitimacy of a government issue from? Is it the will of the people? Right? Can there be a legitimate leadership or legitimate government that does not have the will of the people? What if the will of the people is to execute a whole bunch of other people? Does that suddenly become the legitimate exercise of power if the government acts on that will, and so forth, right? So everything that goes on in political philosophy is, of course, philosophy, political philosophy. It's a kind of applied philosophy. So these questions aren't going away. There's just tons and tons of philosophical
that
questions.
just sounds like a way to maximize your hatred. Politics and philosophy in one subject.
But
you might be more hated than a lawyer at that point,
Well, I'm not sure I'd go that far, but you're certainly approaching it. What about a lawyer philosopher who engages in? Okay, so so politics is a big one for me, but I think that's a big one when we talk about the difference between a republic and a democracy. And this isn't, I mean, this starts to touch on it. This is nowhere near the level that Ozzie, I think, is talking about. But when you talk about, okay, in a democracy, slavery is perfectly legal, because if the majority says we want to enslave a minority, in theory, in a democracy, that's perfectly, as long as the majority agrees. But I think obviously, oh my God, it's not. Yeah, I'm thinking John Stuart Mill with property right, but I mean, a lot of there were very strong political philosophers that really had a lot to do with how the United States was founded and how we think about property, how we think about people, how we think about justice, law, the harm principle. Should we just have something be illegal if it hurts people? That's the harm principle. But then the question is, what's considered harm? If I'm playing music you don't like, or if I'm using words or language that you don't like, is that harm? So it gets very complicated and difficult very quickly. Now, we do have a couple of questions. The best question, Iron Chartier has been asking like 20 questions that he wants answered. So let me why do we like big butts? No, wait, that wasn't Iron Chartier. No, I don't think that was a legit question. I may have read the wrong question on that one.
That I take to be an anthropological question, for which I think there is a satisfactory answer.
So we do have a lot of questions. I'll probably start to. Somebody said they lost their taste for oatmeal, which I was actually thinking the exact same thing. Quite frankly, I appreciate the imagery, Ozzie. So there was a good question. Do you think we need religion?
No, I don't. I think there was a time when we did. I take this broad anthropological view here, but I mean, there was a time when our ancestors lived in small groups of between 70 and 300 people. In populations like that, you can know everybody. In a population that size, where you're living and seeing the same people over and over and over again, your reputation matters. It is possible to govern your behavior in a way that is suitable and conducive to everyone's well-being, just reliant upon pro-social instincts and pro-social emotions, right? There was a time when we were all just tribal, and that worked tolerably well. Not so well when one tribe encountered another tribe, but within the tribe, things worked pretty well. Our pro-social instincts and pro-social emotions work well. When we meet another tribe, our antisocial instincts and antisocial emotions kick in. Right? So I think our biology invested us with what we needed to get along in small groups. You're not going to be a con man when you live in a tribe of 70 or 300 people. You're going to run through your reputational capital very, very quickly and be ostracized. At the very least, your capacity to reproduce is going to be compromised, if not your very life. But once you get
and that's of course important, because if you don't reproduce, you're not going to, at least to the extent that behavior is driven biologically, at least that
right.
part isn't going to get passed on. So this is how morality is being selected for by sort of Darwinian evolution, is creating morality because people who don't behave that way are being selected out, if I understand
right.
correctly.
Yeah, that's why we have the pro-social instincts and pro-social emotions and antisocial instincts and antisocial emotions that we do. Now, once agriculture happens, once we discover agriculture, things change. We move from hunter-gatherers to kind of sedentary. Once you have agriculture, now you've got food in large quantities and huge supplies. You can store food against lean times, against droughts and famines and stuff like that. Your population can explode. You can have a division of labor for the first time. Not everyone has to be, cooperating with finding food and stuff like that. You can have a relegated class of people that are basically in charge of food production, another group of people that are in charge of defending the tribe, another group of people that are dedicated to certain kinds of trades, working with stone, working with wood, and so forth. Division of labor seems to explode after we get agriculture. But another thing happens when your population becomes very, very big. Your pro-social instincts and emotions are no longer enough. Your population, when you live in a megalopolis of hundreds of thousands or 1 million people, a city the size of Rome, for instance, your pro-social instincts and pro-social emotions are not enough to govern your behavior. You're going to have open warfare if that's all you've got. At some point, someone has to impose order. And who's that going to be? Well, whoever has the might to do it. Okay? We move from having chieftains that are respected and operating largely by consensus and respect for elders and stuff like that, to having people who absolutely govern us. That becomes the model for religious authority. Having a king, having a tyrant, having a lord or something like that. At some point, this becomes exaggerated and extrapolated and cantilevered in the abstract to imagining someone that is lord of everything. At some point, the idea that your behavior is going to be governed just by your own personal reactions has to be subsumed and replaced with your behavior can only be governed by an authority that has the might to impose its will upon you, right? The state. And one of the ways the state can impose authority upon you when it's not there to watch you at every moment is to get you to believe that there is an all-seeing eye. And I think that there was a time when our population was big enough and the efficacy of the state was not so great, and our state of ignorance was such that it made sense to imagine a kind of all-seeing king that had all-seeing power that could punish you in the next world, and you would internalize the order of the state, and that would become your moral order. So I think there was a time when religiosity served a purpose. It served a purpose for social cohesion as a result of the explosion in population from agriculture. But I think we have outgrown that. I think that there are more liabilities associated with that. We understand our species better. We know more about the world. And so I think that this kind of superstitious view of a god and the need for a religion, that I think we can just do without that. I mean, I think we have outgrown. That was a product of our infancy after agriculture, but I think we can do well without it now. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer to what could have been said. But I want to explain why I think we can do without religion. I think we've simply outgrown it, but I think there was a time when it would have been sheer chaos if it had not emerged. It seems to me there was a time when religion was an inevitability.
Here's a question that kind of comes from the audience, and I'm slightly adding my a twist to it here. So what's a philosophical question that you enjoy struggling with?
Ooh, that is a good question.
Oh, boy, I have a lot. Okay, well, I love the problem of induction. So the problem of induction is, how do you know that the future will resemble the past? So induction is that form of reasoning where you generalize from particular instances to a general conclusion. The sun rose in the east yesterday, it set in the west. Same thing happened the day before, same thing the day before that, the day before that. And so I conclude on the basis of all of these prior experiences, this is the basis of all learning, that the future will resemble the past. I conclude that in the future, the sun will rise in the east and set in the west. I can think of no instances where it's ever been the reverse or anything else. So that's an inductive inference. I conclude on the basis of many previous observed instances. I generalize and think that this will always hold. It doesn't have to. I know that it's not a logical truth. It is not a matter of logical or metaphysical necessity. But I am making a prediction, and I'm predicting what the future will hold on the basis of the past. The difficulty with the problem of induction, though, is that how do you justify that confidence that the future will resemble the past? Right? You have to assume that the future will resemble the past in certain relevant respects, because if you don't assume that the future will resemble the past, then you have no reason to think that the sun will rise in the east tomorrow and set in the west. You're assuming that it will be that way, right? And why do I assume that the future will resemble the past? Because in the past, the future did resemble the past. But to argue that way is to argue in a circle. It's to use induction in the justification of induction. But we all know that if you justify something using itself, you're arguing in a circle, and that's no good. So the problem of induction is the problem of how to justify your confidence in your inductive conclusions rationally. And unfortunately, there doesn't appear to be a way to do it without arguing in a circle. You're either not arguing it and you just assume, okay, the future will resemble the past. I'm taking that as a blind article of faith. Or you're saying, yeah, I believe that the future will resemble the past because in the past, the future did resemble the past. But now I'm using induction to justify induction, and everyone knows that that's arguing in a circle, and that is a fallacy. You can justify any conclusion that way. So that's not a good justification.
So is it a problem with we don't yet have the philosophical tools to properly answer the problem of induction, or is it merely a problem that there is no other way beyond it, that we were just going to have some kind of faith?
And okay. There's the question. There's the question.
That's it. Okay, so I've come to a fairly settled conclusion on this. Mm-hmm. So some people think, look, we just have not solved this problem. There's a way, but there are ways to solve this problem, perhaps. So, for instance, Karl Popper thought he had a way of solving the problem of induction, right? Because the problem of induction, if it's a legitimate problem, it's not just a problem of everyday life. It's a big problem for science, because all of science utilizes induction, right? The reason I get up out of bed in the morning and put my feet on the floor and march out of my bedroom is because I assume that because the future will resemble the past, my feet won't sink through the floor and I'm not going to fall into my basement. I assume the floor will support my weight. Right? I use induction every moment of my existence. I live as if the future will resemble the past, and I do that when I'm doing science. So anybody who's doing science is obviously assuming that the future will resemble the past. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to make a prediction on the basis of the past, because the future didn't resemble the past. If you didn't assume that much, you wouldn't have any basis for inferring anything on the basis of what came before. Karl Popper's solution to this was, all this talk about induction, there's no such thing. Science actually doesn't work on induction. Yes, people use induction, but science doesn't use induction. Science is a deductive process. Science works by modus tollens. A implies B, not B, therefore not A. If I conduct this experiment, I should see such and such. I don't see such and such, therefore, my experiment is falsified. The principle of refutation, the principle of falsification that is so important to science was Popper's way of solving the problem of induction. He said, science doesn't use induction at all. It appears to use induction, but that's just an illusion. It's a disguised form of deduction. The logic of scientific discovery, which is the name of one of his books, the logic of scientific discovery is deduction. It's modus ponens. That's why he thinks falsifiability and refutability is so important. So one solution to the problem of induction is to say, the way we can know things is strictly through deduction. Screw induction. It's all deduction. And if you're not doing deduction, you're engaged in fallacious reasoning. That was Popper's position. Most people don't realize that about Popper, but that is in fact what his view was. That was his solution to the problem of induction. I have a different view. My view is, we assume that the future will resemble the past for the same reason that my dog does. This is just part of our inherited psychology. This is just how our brains work. It is an assumption. It is literally a wired-in assumption. It is an innate disposition to believe this. Is that a reason to think it's true? Nope. That makes it an article of faith. And so I think that all induction rests, including all scientific induction, rests on an article of faith. I think ultimately, now that doesn't mean that you can believe any old thing on insufficient evidence, but there isn't a good rational reason for trusting in induction. That induction makes sense if you assume a certain thing. That thing you assume, that's an article of faith. In other words, that which we think of as good, responsible, that is epistemologically responsible scientific reasoning, that rests on an article of faith. And I think that is an ineliminable article of faith. There's no way around it. I don't think there's going to be a solution to it. And I think there isn't going to be a solution to it because I don't think natural selection owes it to us to prove to us that the future will resemble the past. The universe doesn't owe us that. Natural selection didn't equip us with that. All that we needed to get by was to have brains that could learn. And to learn is to make inferences on the basis of what came before and extrapolate and make predictions about the future. That's what it is to learn. Our brains are learning engines, right? But tomorrow the world could change. For all we know, the laws of physics will change tomorrow. And you might say, well, what precedent is there for thinking that? There isn't. But your insistence that there has to be a precedent is precisely to assume that the future must resemble the past, which is the article of faith that's at issue. Which is why
there may be a way to answer this question, so to speak. There may be a way to make this logically sound, but not with our brains, is what it's sounding like.
I don't even think that. I think no mind could do it. I think if there were a God wouldn't know that the future is going to resemble the past unless he's able to perceive the future. But if God himself has a future that he can't see into, he'd have the same problem. So my view is that the Humean problem of induction is the human problem of psychology. It is just a problem of how our brains are constructed. It's not a limit that we can't think outside. This isn't something where we just can't think outside the box, but another mind could. I think it's just a fact about the world that there isn't a reason why the future has to resemble the past, right? I mean, even if a person came up with some kind of, you would need a metaphysical proof that the future has to resemble the past, but I don't know what that proof could possibly look like. And if you had that, maybe you could do it. But short a reason to think that the future must resemble the past in relevant respects, I don't think you can ever justify induction. So, I mean, one way we get around it is we just posit that, well, nature just ticks along based on these natural laws. But what are natural laws? Natural laws are just descriptions of physical reality. They're simply generalizations about how nature will tick along in the future on the basis of how it has ticked along in the
What
past.
it
So even appeals to natural laws are really just appeals to induction.
So last question on this. Then does that mean that the tool set that we are using to question the universe, if our if obviously it's there's got to be a flaw somewhere, right? Like we were describing the natural world, and so far that seems to work. Yet we can yet we look and we see that, but the tools that we are using, right, have a flaw based on our own tools that we've come up with. Like we've come up with this tool, the reason and logic, and yet we have to violate that very tool, those very rules, to come up with a description that matches what we observe in nature. So is that an indictment of the tools that we are using?
Well, you could say that, but I mean, I think that's somewhat prejudicial.
Mm-hmm.
Put it that way. But essentially, I think it's this. When we consider the problem of induction, we realize one of our epistemological limits.
Mm-hmm.
It's incredibly epistemologically humbling. But it isn't because there's something wrong with our brains, right? It's simply that there is nothing to guarantee that the future will resemble the past, right? Uh, the, the, Absent something that guarantees that, there's no reason to be confident that the future will resemble the past, no matter how often in the past the future did resemble the past, because again, you'd be arguing in a circle if you appeal to how well induction. I mean, imagine if someone said, "Oh, I know I can rely on induction. Look how well induction has worked for me in the past."
Well, yeah, that's every first year that's the exact argument. You can just wait for it, and that's always the first one that comes. Well, induction's always worked, so we know it's going to continue to work.
Right, but this is not a shortcoming in our psychology or in our minds. It's just it would appear to be a feature of the world, right? That there's nothing that guarantees that. Now, maybe there is something about reality, right? Perhaps it is true of reality that the future will always resemble the past in relevant respects. That might just be. It could just be natural laws, right? That might be. That could just be the way the world is. In which case, um, um, uh, induction is always going to work. But that won't change the fact that we won't, if we don't have an argument, if we don't have a reason to think that that's true about reality, we won't have a justification for our use of induction, right? So in other words, there's no shortcoming in us. There's nothing we're missing, right? It's just we're up against a brute fact about reality, and we don't know which it is, and we just assume that it's one way. So why do I use induction? I use induction for the same reason my dog uses induction. I can't help it. If I don't assume that the future will resemble the past, I would not raise this cup to my lips to drink a cup of tea here, because I would have no reason to assume that in trying to reach for the cup, my hand would actually get to the cup, that I could lift the cup, that I could bring it to my lips, that fluid would pour into my mouth when I open my mouth and I tip the cup, right? If I don't assume that the future will resemble the past, I have no warrant to initiate any action. I would become paralyzed, right? So I have a pragmatic reason why I do it, but that's not a reason for thinking that it's true. That's a reason that motivates me from moment to moment. But that's just a motivation. That's not a reason to think that it's true that the future will resemble the past. So I do have a motivation for assuming that the future will resemble the past. It's my animal nature. It's just how my brain works. I can't even help it. I can't turn it off even if I tried. I can only pretend. But I can't actually get as far as doubting that the future will resemble the past. What I can do is recognize I don't have a good damn reason for this. This is, in fact, an article of faith. This is something that my fellow atheists actually have a hard time with. They don't like hearing that we have articles of faith at the very bottom of our worldview. But I think everyone at the bottom of their worldview has just a score, at least, of what are sometimes called properly basic beliefs, just assumptions about reality that we simply have to take for granted, without justification, so that rationality is even possible. Rationality, in other words, on my view, um, exists only within the scope of certain assumptions. If you don't make certain assumptions, rationality isn't even possible. So rationality, thinking, proper thinking, operates within the scope of a whole pile of assumptions, which are themselves not warranted and not warrantable, except on pain of arguing in a circle, which we all recognize as a fallacy. So that for instance, I think is a philosophical insight into the nature of critical thinking and skepticism that I wish more critical thinkers and skeptics appreciated, because it's quite humbling. And I think if you're going to label yourself and describe yourself as a critical thinker or a skeptic, it behooves you to know what the limits of reasoning are, what its scope and limits are, what its boundary conditions are. And that, I think, is yet another benefit of philosophy.
I think we definitely need to have you back on to just cover Hume's problem of induction, because I think that's one that is grossly underestimated by people, and I think you've explained it well. But it's reasonably simple once you've got it, but to sort of understand the fundamental problem and what it actually means for knowledge, I think is very. So we'll have you back just to discuss that one.
Sure.
But
yeah.
I think we're gonna need to get wrapping up. I want to ask us. So that's one that you're very interested in. Is there one more that any other one that really interests you aside from Hume's problem of induction?
Yeah, there's a more practical one, one that I think is sort of more topical. It has to do with the idea of freedom of thought and expression. For me, freedom of thought and expression is absolutely fundamental. It is fundamental to our concepts of human dignity and autonomy. And it is a concept that I think has been taken for granted for a long time, but it is a concept that is very much under threat right now. I think a lot of people will say, "I believe in freedom of thought and expression," but, and then they'll follow it up with something that clearly demonstrate that they don't believe in the concept at all. And I think one of the reasons people think this way is because it's not obvious how you defend the concept of freedom of thought and expression. And so I think it's something that needs a robust defense. I think John Stuart Mill offered possibly the best defense of freedom of thought and expression in, I think, the third chapter of his work on liberty. I think it's the third chapter. It's been a long time since I've reread it, but it's just an absolute masterpiece. If you're interested in the very notion of freedom of thought and expression, read On Liberty by John Mill. Read the whole book, but there's one chapter in there called, I think, of freedom of thought and expression, something like that. And that chapter alone is a masterpiece. And that is the arguments therein, I think, need to be more widely promulgated. But I think that is a concept that is very much under attack, and it's an important thing to understand, an important thing to be able to defend, because a whole pile of institutions rest on it. Our very democratic institutions rest on it. The very concept of education rests upon it. The mission of the university rests upon this concept. And to the extent that that concept is not properly and rigorously defended, we can undermine all of those institutions. And I think they are, in fact, very seriously undermined because of this.
Well said.
Well, I thank you very much for, first of all, I think this is, in my mind, this was sort of a bit of a primer for having you back, so I sort of discuss some of the basics and then, have you back to discuss some more stuff. I think Hume's problem of induction is one. What was the other one I had said earlier? Like I had forgotten to note it. I got to take care to write these down. There was another one that I said we wanted you back for. So there's Hume's problem of induction. One early on, we said we got to have you back. Maybe it was an epistemological.
I don't know. Was it philosophy of mind? Was it philosophy of mind stuff? No, it was before that. You said that. Yeah, it was before.
Yeah,
that.
it was.
Yeah. We'll have to rewatch this.
Or maybe it was something political, or how do you define? I don't know, but there was. So I think there's a couple of, and philosophy of language is also a biggie for me. So we'll get you back. But
Nick, you're starting to sound like somebody who's interested in philosophy. I don't know where this is coming from. Totally out of left field.
Yeah, this is totally exactly. But you know what, Ozzie, it was absolutely great to have you on. We did get a lot more questions than I think we got to, and I'm hoping they'll come back and then go. But we're hitting the 90-minute mark, and I think we're gonna start to. It's Christmas Eve, but we certainly appreciate you coming on. And
it was
we
an
hope
honor to
you'll come
meet you,
back
man.
soon.
It was fantastic. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. I wonder before we sign off, there's one question, one burning question in the live chat that someone asked that deserves an answer. Someone asked, "What are these wooden things behind me?" They're canoe paddles. I'm an avid canoeist, so that's what those are.
There was a lot of burning questions on there, and a lot of them had to do with like lube and bacon and other topics that just sort of get me thinking that we have. I was gonna do a slam on our audience, but then I just realized, yeah, it's my kind of audience. Like I'm gonna pretend it's not, but it really is.
I want to defend this stream for a second. Someone says that was 80 minutes to answer a yes or no question. Do we still need philosophy? And it wasn't answered. Actually, it was answered almost the first thing. Our guest Ozzie said, yes, we need philosophy, and here is why. So yes, we did answer it. It was answered rather early in the stream. Perhaps you missed it.
Well, and I think the discussion of, look, we're struggling with abortion. I think that's a question that's a philosophy question. I think he explained how and what. Yeah, and then I think Doorknob had said something else. I think when discussing induction that I was like, we should get into, but I think we're going to let Ozzie go. And but I think there's a lot more to get onto, and so I hope you'll come back. I hope we didn't scare you off, but it was a genuine pleasure.
It really was.
This was my pleasure. Was all mine. This was first of all, it's an honor to be invited onto anybody's live streams, but this is a subject that's near and dear to my heart, so I really appreciated the invitation. Thank you very much. And to everyone who's watching, have a very, very Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, everybody. Happy holidays, and good night, or good evening, or good afternoon, depending on where you are.